Thousands of people are tonight languishing on the public housing wait list, while almost 1,500 homes remain empty across the state.
The numbers revealed exclusively to Nine News in damning data, exposing just how many South Australians are holding out hope of one day having their own roof to sleep under.
140,000 homes across Australia are sitting completely empty right now. The landlords who own them are refusing to rent them out, not because the properties need work, not because there are no tenants, but because they have done the numbers and the numbers tell them to leave the home dark. In the worst rental crisis this country has ever recorded, leaving a property completely vacant is, for a growing number of Australian investors, the smarter financial decision. That is not a conspiracy theory, it is arithmetic. Researchers at Prosper Australia did not rely on census forms to find these homes. They went to the water companies, Yarra Valley Water, Southeast Water, Great Western Water, and pulled the actual consumption records across nearly 2 million Melbourne properties, looking for one specific thing: homes that used 0 litres of water every single day for an entire calendar year. Not low usage, not seasonal dips, 0. The answer for 2024 alone was 31,890 homes in Melbourne, completely empty, every day, all year, up 16% from the year before. When you include homes barely used, running on less than a quarter of what a single person living alone consumes, the Melbourne figure climbs past 100,000, 1 in every 20 homes in the city, dark or effectively abandoned. Nationally, the figure reaches 140,000. While those homes sit locked and silent, 254,571 Australian households are on social housing waitlists. Of those, 122,457 have been formally classified as being in greatest need. They are not waiting for something better. They are already homeless or living somewhere so dangerous it is actively threatening their health. That number grew 12% in a single year. Last year, more than 56,000 people who went looking for crisis accommodation were turned away because there was simply nothing left to offer them. Every single hour, more than 3,200 Australians reach out to homelessness services for help. 140,000 empty homes, 250,000 households on wait lists. These two facts are not coincidence. One is producing the other, and the chain between them runs directly through 30 years of tax policy that has made sitting on an empty property one of the most financially rewarding decisions an Australian investor can make. Right now, the rental market is the worst it has been in living memory for anyone trying to live in one. A healthy rental market has a vacancy rate of around 3 to 4%, 3 or 4 homes available per 100 in the area. That slim buffer is what gives renters the ability to negotiate on price, to walk away from a bad landlord, to take a day before signing rather than panicking. Below 3%, that power begins to disappear. Below 1%, it is gone entirely. Australia's national vacancy rate in early 2026 sits at 1.2%. In Perth, it has been as low as 0.3. In Brisbane and Adelaide, around 0.8. When a rental listing goes up in those cities, it is now routine for more than 100 applications to arrive within 24 hours. Renters are showing up to inspections with printed payslips, written references, and personal statements explaining why they deserve to be considered. They are offering months of rent upfront just to stand out. They are applying for homes they have never seen inside, in suburbs they are uncertain about, because missing the window means going back to the start in a market that has no patience for hesitation. The tenant no longer selects a home. The landlord selects a candidate from a long, desperate queue of people competing for the right to pay someone else's mortgage. The national median rent ended 2025 at $681 a week, having risen 5.2% across the year, nearly 1.5 times the rate of inflation, and the growth was accelerating as the year closed, not easing. In Sydney, the median weekly rent for a house is $800, not a waterfront property, not a prestigious suburb, the absolute middle of the Sydney rental market. And rental listings nationally sit 17% below their 5-year average, which means the supply gap is not closing, it is widening. 5-year average, which means the supply gap is not closing, it is widening. The Productivity Commission's January 2026 report captured what this is doing to real people in a single devastating number. 43% of low-income renters are still in rental stress, even after receiving Commonwealth rent assistance, a payment the government created specifically to make housing affordable for people who cannot manage it otherwise. After receiving that help, those renters are still spending more than 30% of their gross income on rent alone. Every dollar beyond that threshold is a dollar not spent on groceries, on electricity, on a child's school excursion, or a doctor's appointment. More than 1 in 3 people who sought crisis or longer-term accommodation in the same period were simply turned away. Nothing available. The system had nothing left. That is the rental market that 140,000 empty homes are sitting inside. The question is why any landlord would look at all of that and still choose not to rent. Most people assume a landlord makes money through rent. You buy a property, a tenant pays weekly, and that income is your return. In theory, yes. In Australian cities, in practice, the numbers do not work that way at all. Think of it simply. If a property is worth $800,000 and it rents for $32,000 a year, the return from rent alone is 4%. In Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane, that number typically sits between 2 and 4%. And in many cases, it is actually below the interest rate on the landlord's mortgage, which means the rent coming in does not even cover the cost of owning the property. The investment is running at a financial loss while someone is living in it. The profit comes from something else entirely, from the property's value going up over time. When the landlord eventually sells, they pocket the difference between what they paid and what it fetches. That increase in value, capital growth, happens whether the home has a tenant in it or not. An empty house grows in value at exactly the same rate as a house with a family inside. Look at what actually happened in Melbourne between July and September of 2025. House prices rose 2.2% in a single quarter, just 90 days. That translated to a median gain of $23,045. In those same 3 months, a landlord receiving Melbourne's median rent of $580 a week collected around $7,500. 3 months of leaving the property completely empty generated more than 3 times the wealth of 3 months of active renting, before subtracting a single cent of costs. And those costs are real. Property management fees run 8 to 10% off every rent payment. Maintenance is legally required. A broken heater or leaking roof must be fixed at the landlord's expense, whether the timing suits them or not. Landlord insurance, council rates, land tax. Victoria alone has introduced more than 130 tenancy law reforms since 2019. Minimum heating standards, pet rights, limits on inspections, restrictions on rent increases. Each one adds another layer of obligation and another reason to calculate whether it is worth it. And sitting beneath all of that is the risk that shapes landlord behavior more than anything else. A tenant who stops paying rent and cannot be removed quickly. Victoria's tenancy tribunal process can stretch across many months. During all of it, the mortgage falls due, the rates arrive, the management fee still gets taken, and no rent comes in. One bad tenancy dispute can wipe out years of marginal profit. Add those costs and risks to a return that barely covers the mortgage in the first place. And for a growing number of owners in high-growth markets, renting out is not just less profitable than staying empty. It is worse on paper. Consider what an investor actually sees when they do the full comparison. Renting out means accepting a 2 to 4% yield, then subtracting 10% for the agent, then subtracting maintenance costs that cannot be predicted or refused, then absorbing the compliance burden of an evolving tenancy law framework, then accepting the possibility, however unlikely, that a single bad tenant could lock them into a tribunal process that runs for months. Against all of that sits the alternative. Do nothing, pay a modest vacancy tax, and watch the asset appreciate. Prosper Australia, the group that produced the water meter data, uses one word for this decision: rational, not greed, rational. A calculation the system constructed and that investors are completing correctly. When a landlord eventually sells an investment property, the profit, the difference between what they paid and what they sold it for, is called a capital gain. Australia's capital gains tax discount, embedded in federal law since 1999, means that if you have held the property for more than 12 months, you only pay tax on half of that profit. The other half is completely tax-free. So every dollar made from a property going up in value is worth twice as much after tax as every dollar earned from rent. That single rule is the foundation of everything you are watching unfold. But there is more. On top of the capital gains discount sits negative gearing, and this one is worth understanding because it is extraordinary. If your investment property makes a loss, if the rent coming in is less than the mortgage payments, fees and maintenance going out, the government lets you use that loss to reduce the tax on your regular salary. If you earn $120,000 a year and your investment property loses $20,000, you only pay income tax as if you earned $100,000. The taxpayer covers part of your property loss. Negative gearing cost the federal budget $10.9 billion in 2023 to 24, projected to hit $12.3 billion the year after. Over $10 billion a year subsidizing investment property losses, with no requirement that those investments actually shelter anyone. That is the architecture that produces 140,000 empty homes. Not negligence, not accident, 30 years of deliberate tax design that made property the most rewarding asset to hold in Australia, and never asked what happened to the people on the other side of that decision. The 140,000 empty properties across Australia are not all the same problem, and treating them as one is exactly why the government's attempts to fix this keep failing. They are at least 5 completely different situations that happen to share the same outcome, and the distinction matters enormously. Some are deceased estates, homes frozen in legal limbo while a will is being settled, where nobody can sell, rent, or do anything with the property until the courts and administrators finish their work. Probate in Australia can take well over a year in contested estates, and during the entire wait, the home sits dark with no mechanism to put it to productive use. The family may genuinely want it sold or rented. The law simply does not allow it yet. Some are renovation traps, owners who bought rundown homes with genuine intent to fix and rent them, only to find that building costs across Australia have surged sharply since 2020, and qualified tradespeople are booked months in advance. A project scoped at 5 months stretches to 15. The home sits empty and unlettable throughout, contributing to the vacancy count through no act of deliberate withholding. The owner wants to rent. The industry cannot deliver the work fast enough to let them. Some are holiday homes and Airbnb properties, and this category is doing catastrophic damage in specific parts of Australia. A University of Sydney report from July 2025 found more than 174,000 Airbnb listings nationally. In Byron Shire, they make up nearly 18% of all housing stock. In tourist-heavy regional towns, a study by the housing group Grounded found that 74% of all new homes built over the past decade were absorbed into short-term rentals rather than permanent housing. In Byron Bay specifically, the figure was 124%. Short-term rentals were consuming new construction faster than it could be built. Byron Shire introduced a 60-day cap on Airbnb in September 2024 to fix this. An independent evaluation a year later found no evidence it had worked. Long-term rental bonds in the area fell after the cap was introduced. Rents rose 5 to 7% regardless. Property owners simply left homes empty rather than becoming long-term landlords. Then there are land bankers, investors sitting on undeveloped land waiting for values to rise before selling. And finally, the deliberate withholder, the owner who has run every calculation in this video and concluded that doing nothing is the smartest financial move available to them. This matters because a vacancy tax does nothing for a deceased estate. A renovation grant does nothing for a land banker. Airbnb restrictions do not touch the deliberate withholder. Australia has spent years treating 5 separate problems as one, and the results are exactly what you would expect. Victoria has tried harder than any other state on this. It introduced Australia's first vacant residential land tax in 2017, expanded it statewide in 2025, extended it to undeveloped land blocks in 2026, and launched enforcement raids into apartment towers suspected of evading it, uncovering 177 liable properties across 5 buildings and expanding the investigation to 13 more towers. In 2024, the tax was collected on exactly 1,779 properties, against an estimated 100,000 empty or barely used homes in Melbourne alone. That is less than 2%, less than 1 in 50. And in the months after the statewide expansion, the policy's biggest moment, Melbourne's rental vacancy rate did not improve. It fell to 1.5% by March 2025. Conditions for renters got worse the quarter after the government's most ambitious intervention. The reason comes back to the same maths that runs through everything in this video. A property worth $800,000 growing at 2% a year gains $16,000 in value simply by existing. Victoria's vacant residential land tax, at its current rate of 1% of capital improved value in the first year, rising to 2% and then 3% for consecutive years of vacancy, costs the owner a fraction of that annual appreciation. On an $800,000 property, the first-year tax bill is $8,000, exactly half of the $16,000 in capital growth the property generated in the same 12 months. The owner pays the tax, pockets the other $8,000, and makes no different decision. When the annual penalty for leaving a home empty is smaller than the annual financial reward for doing so, the tax is not functioning as a deterrent. It is an administrative fee that investors absorb, record in their accounts, and forget, while the fundamental calculation remains completely unchanged. Other countries have solved this. France, once a property has sat empty for a full year, charges a vacancy tax of 17% of its annual rental value, rising to 34% from the second year. Not 17% of some nominal council rate, 17% of what the property would actually earn if rented. On a home worth $50,000 a year in rent, that is $8,500 in year 1, $17,000 from year 2. That is a number that changes what a spreadsheet says. Vancouver charges 3% of the property's assessed market value, what it would actually sell for. On $1 million property, that is $30,000 a year for leaving it unoccupied. Vacancy rates in targeted Vancouver areas measurably fell after that tax was introduced, because for the first time the penalty exceeded the benefit. Denmark goes further. After 6 months of vacancy, local councils can lease the property to approved tenants directly. The owner does not get a vote. The home gets used. Australia charges a vacancy tax that in most high-growth markets costs less than the capital gain the property is generating while it sits empty. France figured this out. Vancouver figured this out. Australia is still running the maths the landlord's way. There are 254,571 households on social housing waitlists. Among them, 122,457 are in greatest need, already homeless, or in housing so dangerous it threatens their health. That number grew 12% in a single year. In October 2025, demand for children's homelessness services in Brisbane surged 48% in a single month. Not adults navigating difficult choices. Children arriving at crisis services at nearly double the rate of the year before, in the same city where investment properties sit dark because the quarterly capital gain outweighs the entire annual rental income. Prosper Australia calculated it directly. Melbourne's vacant and barely used housing stock alone is equivalent to 2.5 years of new construction, enough to house every single person on Victoria's public housing waitlist twice over. The solution to Victoria's entire social housing backlog already exists in the form of physical structures spread across the city. The properties are built, the materials are in place, the addresses exist. The only thing missing is a system that makes using them more financially compelling than leaving them empty. Australia has not failed to build enough homes. It has built homes and then constructed a tax framework so heavily weighted toward capital growth that abandoning those homes to darkness is, In many suburbs, the optimal financial strategy. Every capital gains tax concession that made property growth twice as valuable as rent after tax contributed to this. Every vacancy penalty set below the rate of appreciation contributed. Every year that negative gearing cost the federal budget over $10 billion without requiring a single tenant to be housed in return contributed. The empty property on your street is not a quirk or a coincidence. It is the system doing exactly what it was designed to do. The 2026 federal budget did announce changes to negative gearing and the capital gains discount, the most significant property tax reforms in a generation, and they are real. But they are prospective, they exempt new builds, and they are grandfathered for every property held as of budget night in May 2026. The bulk of existing empty investment properties continue operating under the old rules for years, possibly decades. Meaningful reform, arriving far too slowly for the 250,000 households already on the waitlist. Australia does not have a housing shortage. It has a housing allocation crisis. Homes concentrated into investment portfolios, tax treatment engineered to reward holding over renting, and penalties for vacancy too small to change the rational decision. The homes exist, they are not available, and until owning an empty home costs more than renting it out, the maths will not change, the waitlists will keep growing, and the properties will stay dark. If you have seen this in your suburb, the apartment block that filled its car park but never filled its windows, the development that finished 18 months ago and still looks unoccupied at night, the house at the end of the street where the lights have never once come on, drop it in the comments, because that property is not empty by accident. It is empty because a system built over 30 years made it the smartest financial choice, and the people on the other side of that choice are the ones sleeping in cars.